Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov took center stage as he chaired a meeting on international peace, denouncing what it called a broken unipolar world order.
As Christ says in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, nation shall rise against nation, meaning the Kenite nation, whose shadow government is symbolized by the he-goat of Daniel chapter 8. Kenites means the sons of Cain, who is the son of Satan, and the four hidden dynasties of the Kenites are education, economics, politics, and religion. 1830 being when the four hidden dynasties began to be globalized, when the first trumpet began to sound, and the four hidden dynasties are the four horns you can read of in Zechariah chapter 1, which are used to plant the seed of the mark of the beast in the foreheads of most Christians, which won't come to fruition until Satan appears as the Antichrist. And as you can see in the last verse of Revelation 13, here is wisdom, let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, that man of sin, as Satan is called in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and his number is 666. And that word translated as count means to enumerate stones worn smooth, as you can see when you look up this word translated as count in the Greek dictionary of the Strong's Concordance, the stones worn smooth being symbolic of the Kenites, who are from the false rock, meaning Satan, who will appear as the false Christ in Jerusalem at the sixth seal, the sixth trumpet, and the sixth vial, 2.5 months after the one world political system comes into being at the woe of the fifth trumpet, which is when the he-goat of Daniel chapter 8 becomes the leopard of Daniel chapter 7, which is symbolic of the Kenites and their four hidden dynasties, providing the infrastructure of the so-called New World Order. Until then, the Kenites, who are called the robbers of thy people in Daniel 11:14, will continue to exalt themselves to establish the vision, meaning the vision of a one-world government, but they shall fall, which in the Hebrew is a word which means in this case to fail, because there will be no New World Order, as it's called, until the woe of the fifth trumpet, when Satan and his angels get cast to earth. Again, nation shall rise against nation means the Kenite nation rising up against itself through two warring factions, which are the Kenites on the multipolar end of the globalist spectrum, controlling the Ezekiel 38 Confederacy from behind the scenes, the Russian Federation being the current king of the North, according to the Daniel 11 hypothesis on biblicalresearchlabs.com, while the Kenites on the unipolar end of the globalist spectrum, for the most part, control the left-right paradigm, which is symbolized by Ammon and Moab, the left-right paradigm having been taken over by the Stalinists and the Trotskyites. But also within the left-right paradigm are agents of Edom, meaning politicians, journalists, and influencers working for the multipolarist Kenites, in an ongoing propaganda war being waged through the electronic media, which is part of the hidden dynasty of education. In 1830 is when Joseph Henry's foundational research on the electromagnetic telegraph dates back to, according to the Smithsonian Institutional Archives, and from the electromagnetic telegraph would come the telephone, radio, television, and finally the internet. 1830 was also the beginning of the same decade of the educational reform movement, which was based on the Prussian model, which brought about a militarized school system which would become the K through 12 system, which is how the initial brainwashing occurs even to this day, which is then supplemented through the electronic media made possible by the technology that began to be developed in 1830. The President of the United States at the time was Andrew Jackson, who was the first president to be part of the Democratic Party, and then in 1836 a group called the League of the Just was founded, which in 1847 merged with the Communist Correspondence Committee to form the Communist League, which is who Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto for. Marx and Engels having adapted the Hegelian dialectic into their arsenal, and then in 1850 1854, the GOP came into being with Abraham Lincoln, who was the first Republican president, being sworn into office in 1861, and during that time, the Kenites were able to control the narrative more and more, with the Associated Press being founded in 1846, while Reuters was established in 1851, all part of the hidden dynasty of education, and the Democratic Party would later get completely taken over by the Stalinists in 1933, and the GOP was taken over in 1980 by the Trotskyites, who called themselves neoconservatives. And again, the left-right paradigm is for the most part controlled by the unipolarist Kenites, but obviously there are double agents within the left-right paradigm via the multipolarist Kenites. 1913 is when the second trumpet began to sound, which lines up with the hidden dynasty of economics, 1913 being the year of the Federal Reserve Act, which was immediately followed by the First World War that brought about the USSR, the second king of the North, according to the Daniel 11 hypothesis, and it also brought about the Council on Foreign Relations, which was basically created as a result of the failure of the League of Nations, which you can read of in Daniel chapter 11 verses 16 through 19, according to the Daniel 11 hypothesis, and the CFR was designed to carry out Plan B, which was obviously a second world war that brought about the United Nations in 1945 when the third trumpet began to sound, which lines up with the hidden dynasty of politics, as well as Kenite-occupied Israel when the fourth trumpet began to sound in 1948, setting the stage for Satan to appear in Jerusalem as the Antichrist 2.5 months after the so-called New World Order comes into being at the woe of the fifth trumpet, after the great horn of the he-goat written of in Daniel chapter 8 verse 8 gets broken, which is the same word in the Hebrew translated as destroyed in Daniel chapter 11 verse 20. The great horn of the he-goat, as well as the one who sends a raiser of taxes in Daniel 11:20, is the United Nations, in my opinion. And as you can see in Daniel chapter 8 verse 8, after the great horn is broken, the four notable ones will rise up to replace it, the four notable ones being the four beasts of Daniel chapter 7 that come into being at the woe of the fifth trumpet as the one world political system of Revelation 13, having 7 heads, which are symbolic of the 7 continents of the planet Earth. And once that one world political system receives a deadly wound, Satan will appear as the Antichrist in Jerusalem at the 6th seal, the 6th trumpet, and the 6th vial. And then 2.5 months later, the true Christ will return at 777, meaning the 7th trumpet, the 7th vial, and immediately after the space of half an hour written of in the 7th seal.